There was a door at the heart of Ravenmoor Hall that had not opened in 7 winters. It stood at the end of the east passage, past the cold conservatory and the shrouded portraits, a low oak door bound in iron and grown over on its garden side with a tangle of dead briar. Behind it lay a walled physic garden and a still-room that had once perfumed the whole house with lavender and bruised mint. Behind it, too, lay the truth of how the Duke of Ravenmoor had come by the scars that made the district cross itself when his carriage passed. The servants did not speak of the fire. They only lowered their eyes when they passed the sealed door, as though the ash of that night still hung in the cold air. And when Eleanor Merrick came to Ravenmoor as its unwilling bride, sold, the village would have whispered, to a monster to settle a dying man's debt, she was told one thing before she was told anything else. She might go anywhere in the house she pleased, up any stair and into any room, save that she must never, on any account, ask for the key to that door. She was a healer's kin, raised among tinctures and dried herbs, and a locked garden was, to her, very like a locked wound. Some part of her knew already that she would open it. She did not yet know that what waited inside would tell her who the scarred man she had married truly was, and whom, on the worst night of his life, he had carried out of the flames. The apothecary's shop stood at the crooked end of Wexcombe's Market Street, its bow window crowded with blue glass bottles that caught the morning light and threw it, faintly coloured, across the worn counter. Eleanor had swept that counter every day of her remembered life. She knew the shop the way other women knew a psalm, the shallow drawers of dried feverfew and rue, the hanging bunches of tansy and horehound, the great ledger where her father, Josiah Merrick, a frail stooped apothecary with ink-stained fingers and a rattling cough, kept his accounts in a careful, failing hand. It was that ledger, in the end, that undid them. The trouble had come slowly, the way real trouble always does. A hard winter, then a wet spring that rotted the customer's custom along with their crops. A physician newly come to the county who scorned the shop and told the gentry that an apothecary's remedies were a peasant's superstition. Josiah's cough deepening from a nuisance to a nightly terror, so that he could no longer stand the long hours at the still. And beneath all of it, quiet as damp, a debt, borrowed against the shop in a lean year, then borrowed against again to keep the borrowing afloat until the sum had swollen past anything the little counter could repay. The man who held that debt was a factor named Rook, a lean, smiling person in a bottle-green coat who came on the first of each month and grew less patient with each visit. On the morning our story truly begins, he came a day early, and he did not smile at all. "The shop, then," he said, turning his hat in his hands as though it were the sad conclusion of a sum done fairly. "The shop and the fixtures, and your father to the sponging house for the remainder. Unless," he let the word hang, "unless there is some other arrangement to be found." Eleanor stood very straight behind the counter, her hands folded, and did not let him see that her heart had gone to water. Behind the curtain that divided shop from lodging, she could hear her father's cough, the wet catch of it, the long labor of the breath afterward. He would not survive a sponging house winter. She knew that as surely as she knew feverfew from foxglove. "What arrangement," she said, "could you possibly mean?" Rook's smile came back, thin as a paper cut. "The Duke of Ravenmoor," he said, "holds the paper now. Bought it up a fortnight past, the whole of it, and your father's note besides. A strange fancy for a great man, you'll say, to trouble himself over so small a sum. He leaned closer, and she smelled the sweetness of pastilles on his breath. The Duke does not want your shop, Miss Merrick. The Duke wants a wife. It took her a moment to understand him, and when she did, she felt the floor tilt. Everyone in Wexcombe knew of the Duke of Ravenmore, and no one in Wexcombe had seen him in 7 years. Gabriel Thorne, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark tailcoat, the left side of his jaw drawn tight with old burned scars, kept half in shadow. That was the shape of him in the district's imagination, pieced together from a coachman's glimpse and a footman's gossip. There had been a fire at the hall, they said, a terrible one, in the physic garden and stillroom where the old Duchess brewed her charitable remedies. The Duchess had died in it. The heir had been burned dragging himself out, and had never after that shown his face in a church or a ballroom or a market square. He had sealed the ruined garden, dismissed half the household, and shut himself up at Ravenmore with the shades drawn. Some said he had gone mad with grief. Others, less kind, said he had set the blaze himself, drunk or careless or worse, and that the scars were God's own brand upon a man who had let his mother burn. They called him the Beast of Ravenmore, and they said it half in pity and half in fear. And this was the man who would clear her father's debt, if she would only consent to be his wife. She should have refused. A wiser woman, a colder one, would have refused. But that night her father's cough brought up something dark onto his handkerchief, and he hid it from her too late, and she saw in his grey face how little time the shop had left to give him, even if the debt were forgiven. In the small hours, sitting by his bed with a candle guttering low, Eleanor made her choice the way she made her remedies, carefully without illusion, weighing what could be saved against what must be spent. "I will not have it," Josiah said, when she told him at dawn. His voice shook. "I will go to the sponging house first. I will die there before I sell you to that." "You will not die anywhere," she said, and took his ink-stained hand in both of hers. "You will stay in this shop, in this bed, and you will drink the whorehound I leave you, and you will get well. That is the whole of the bargain, Father, a house on a hill for you, and a warm room, and I am a healer. Whatever he is, a man cannot frighten a woman who is not afraid of a fever." She smiled, and made it look easy, and did not tell him that her hands had not stopped trembling since Rook left. Besides, they say he keeps a physic garden gone to ruin. I should like to see it set right. She did not know then how true that idle word would prove. She only knew that she had a father to save, and a skill in her hands, and that if the price of both was a scarred stranger on a dark hill, she would pay it, and not weep where anyone could see. The banns were not read. A great man in disgrace does not care to be talked of in a parish church, and so it was a license and a hurried service in the hall's own cold chapel a fortnight later, with 2 servants for witnesses, and the Duke's own chaplain reading the words too fast. Eleanor wore her mother's grey wool, made over, and carried no flowers, for it was the wrong season and she had refused out of some flinty pride to let them buy her a bouquet with her father's money returned to her. She saw her husband for the first time by candlelight, and she had steeled herself to be brave, and still her breath caught, not, she would think later, from the scars, but from the stillness of him. Gabriel Thorne stood at the chancel step with his ruined side turned to the shadow, as a man stands who has spent years learning exactly where the light will fall. He was tall and dark and very quiet, and when the chaplain bid him take her hand, his fingers were cold and did not close around hers. He spoke his vows in a low, roughened voice, looking at the floor. Only once at the end did he look at her directly, and his eyes were a startling clear gray in that scarred and shadowed face, and in them she read not cruelty and not madness, but a wariness so deep and so old that it wrung her healer's heart before she could stop it. He looked, she thought, like a wound that has been left too long unbound, and has learned to fear the touch that would clean it. "You need not be afraid of me," he said to her, very low, so that the servants could not hear. It was the first thing her husband ever said to her that was only for her, and it was the wrong thing, for it told her at once that he expected to be feared. "I am not," she said, and found to her own surprise that it was true. They did not speak again that night. He bowed to her at the foot of the great stair, a formal distant bow, and went one way, and a stout grey-haired housekeeper in black bombazine with a ring of keys at her waist led Eleanor the other, up into the cold heart of the house that was now, God help her, her home. Ravenmore Hall by night was a place of shrouded shapes and long echoes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, she gave her name, in a voice that gave nothing else, carried a branch of candles that woke the gilt of picture frames and let it die again as they passed. Half the rooms were shut, their furniture ghosted under Holland cloth. The air smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and beneath it, very faint, something green and bitter that Eleanor's trained nose caught and could not name. "His Grace keeps to the west wing, Mrs., Pruitt said as they climbed. "You'll not be troubled by him. Your rooms are made up in the east, warm as we could make them. You'll dine alone unless he sends word, which he will not." She said it flatly. Neither kind nor unkind, a woman reciting the terms of a weather she had long since stopped fighting. Mrs. Pruitt Eleanor stopped on the landing, where a tall window let in a bar of moonlight. "I am told there is a garden here, a physic garden, and a stillroom." The candles did not waver, but something in the housekeeper's broad face closed like a shutter. "There was," she said. "I am a healer, my father is an apothecary. I thought, if it is only gone to seed, I might be of some use setting it. You'll not ask for that key." Mrs. Pruitt's voice had not risen, but it had gone hard and final as the iron on the door below. "Not of me, nor of his Grace, nor of any soul under this roof. That door stays shut. It is the one thing he asks of anyone who comes here, and it is the one thing you will give him. Do you understand me, Your Grace?" The title came out strange, half a courtesy and half a warning. "I understand," Eleanor said. She did not say that she agreed, and Mrs. Pruitt, who was no fool, marked the difference and said nothing, and led her the rest of the way in silence. Her rooms were indeed warm, a fire lit and a supper laid, and when the door had shut and she was alone at last, Eleanor sat down on the edge of the strange bed in the strange house and let herself, for exactly the space of 100 slow breaths, be as frightened and as lonely as she truly was. Then she rose, unpacked her small bag, and set out on the mantel the 3 things she had brought from home: a stone mortar worn smooth by her mother's hand, a roll of clean linen for bandaging, and a little book of remedies in her own cramped script. Wherever a healer keeps those 3 things, she had always believed, is a place where good may yet be done. She looked at them a long while in the firelight. Then she went to the window and looked out over the black gardens, and somewhere below and to the east she could make out the pale line of a high stone wall, and a gate in it, and the dead briar climbing the gate like a wound stitched shut. I will open you, she thought, before she quite knew she was thinking it. Not to pry, only because you are hurt and I do not know how to leave a hurt thing alone. She woke the first morning to a grey light and an unfamiliar ceiling, and for the space of one slow breath did not know where she lay. And then she remembered all of it, the chapel and the cold vow, and the low, distant bough at the foot of the stair, and she rose and dressed herself without help, for she had never in her life kept a maid, and did not mean to begin the habit now. The house by daylight was no warmer than by night, only clearer in its sadness, and she walked the length of it alone that first morning, while it was still a bed, reading it the way she read a patient's face. She found a music room with an instrument shrouded under holland cloth, and a sheet of music still open on the stand, as though someone had risen mid-phrase and never sat down again. She found a long gallery of thorn faces going back through the centuries, stern men and handsome women in the stiff dress of older reigns, and near the end of the row, a paler oblong on the paneling where a frame had plainly once hung and been taken down, the wall behind it unfaded, a portrait removed rather than mourned. She did not need to be told whose likeness had hung there. She found, too, a small plain room off the west stair that could only have been a schoolroom, a globe gone grey with dust, a shelf of well-thumbed books, a low bench by the window worn smooth. She stood in the doorway of it a long while. It was the one room in the house, she thought, that grief had forgotten to shroud, and it told her more about the man she had married than anything he was likely to say aloud, that he had been happy here once, and taught, and loved, in the ordinary sunlit way of a house that had not yet learned to fear its own east passage. By the time the household stirred, Eleanor had made up her mind. She could not warm a house of this size by wishing, and she could not undo in a morning whatever had frozen it. But she was a healer, and there is always, in any house of the suffering, a place to begin. She rolled her sleeves and went down to the kitchens to find it. The first days at Ravenmoor were days of quiet reconnaissance, the way the first hours at any sick-bed are given to watching before touching. Eleanor did not press. She learned the house instead. She learned that the kitchens were run by a cook named Mrs. Dill who wept easily and worked hard, and that the household had shrunk to a fraction of what such a house should hold, a handful of maids, 2 footmen grown old in service, a groom, and Mrs. Pruitt over all of them like a sergeant over a garrison too small to hold its walls. She learned that the Duke walked at night. She would hear him, some hours past midnight, the uneven tread of him along the west gallery, back and forth, a man patrolling the border of his own sleeplessness. She learned, too, that they were all of them a little ill, in the way of people who live shut up and grieving. Mrs. Dill's hands cracked and bled at the knuckle from lie and cold. A housemaid named Alice, a slight quiet woman with a scald on her forearm gone angry and red, had bound it with a dirty rag and told no one. The old footman, Pettigrew, wheezed on the stairs. It was a household nursing 100 small wounds and calling none of them by name, and to Eleanor's eye it was as plain as a rash. She did what she had always done. She began quietly to mend them. She had brought a little of her own store of simples, and she stretched it with what the kitchen garden and the hedgerows could give. Comfrey for Mrs. Dill's cracked hands, made into a salve over the kitchen fire, a clean dressing, and a poultice of bread and honey for Alice's scald, changed every day with her own hands, until the red went down, and the maid looked at her with the dumb astonishment of one who has forgotten she might be cared for. She brewed horehound and coltsfoot for Pettigrew's chest. She asked for nothing in return, and she made no speeches, and within a fortnight the temper of the house had changed toward her in the small, unmistakable ways that servants signal welcome. A fire lit before she asked. The best of the bread set by for her tray, Mrs. Dill's easy tears now turned to easy smiles. Only two things in the great house resisted her. The first was the sealed door at the end of the east passage, which she passed each day and did not touch, though she felt it there like a held breath. The second was her husband. Gabriel Thorne kept his word and his distance both. He sent on the third day a stiff and formal note in a strong, dark hand, hoping she found her rooms comfortable and begging her to want for nothing. She wrote back a warm, plain answer and received no reply. He did not dine with her. He did not seek her out. Once crossing the great hall at dusk, she saw him at the far end, a tall, dark shape half turned into the shadow of the stair, and she curtsied and said good evening, and for a moment he stood as though caught, his scarred side to the dark by long habit, and then he bowed and was gone before she could cross to him. It was, she thought, less the avoidance of a cold man than the flinching of a burned one. He moved through his own house like a man moving through a room full of mirrors, forever managing the angle at which he might be seen. She might have let it be. A marriage of convenience asks no more than convenience, but Eleanor Merrick had never in her life been able to walk past a thing in pain and leave it be, and by the second week she had begun, gently, to lay siege to her husband's solitude, the only way she knew. With small kindnesses offered, and no answer required. A pot of the good comfrey salve, left outside his study door, with a note in her plain hand, for the hands, if the old burns trouble them in the cold, they will. A book from the shop she had thought to bring, an herbal with fine engraved plates, sent along by Mrs. Pruitt with her compliments. A dish of the coltsfoot honey she had made, because she had heard him coughing too once, through the wall of the gallery, the dry cough of a man whose lungs had breathed smoke and never quite forgiven it. She did not know, those first weeks, whether any of it reached him at all. The salve pot came back empty, once left outside her own door in the night without a word, and she chose to read that emptiness as an answer, and smiled at it, and made more. It was the old burns that gave her the first true opening. She had guessed at them. A man scarred as he was scarred does not pass a cold snap without pain, for burned skin never learns again how to be supple, and pulls and cracks and aches in the damp. And Raven Moor in the grip of a wet autumn was nothing but damp. She had seen it in how he moved, the careful way he held his left arm, the stiffness of the hand. So when a raw north wind came down off the moor, and the whole house huddled to its fires, Eleanor was not surprised to find the west gallery walked earlier than usual and longer, the sleepless tread beginning before the house was even abed. She rose, put on her wrapper, took a candle, and the little jar of salve she had made that day of purpose. Beeswax and sweet oil and the clean sap of comfrey worked soft and went to find her husband. He was standing at the tall gallery window with his back to her and his left hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and she understood at once, with the swift certainty of her craft, that he pressed it there because the chill of the pain dulled the burning of the scar. He did not hear her over the wind at first. She saw in the moonlight the line of his jaw and throat, where the smooth skin gave way to the drawn and silvered ruin of the burn, running down beneath his collar, and she saw how he cradled the hand, and her whole heart moved toward him the way it moved toward any creature suffering alone in the dark. "It is the cold that does it," she said, softly, so as not to startle him, though he startled all the same, drawing the ruined side away in the same motion, that lifelong exhausted choreography. The old burns, they pull worst in weather like this. I have made you something that will ease it, if you will let me. You should not be here, he said. His voice was rough and low, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of exhausted alarm, a man discovered. It is late. And I am not a sight for. You are a burn that pains you in the cold, Eleanor said quite steadily, and I am a healer, and I have dressed 100 such, and I have never once yet been frightened by one. May I see the hand? Afterward she thought it was that word, hand, that undid his guard, the plainness of it. The way she had asked for the hand as a physician asks, and not for his face as a gawker asks. He looked at her a long moment in the moonlight, this quiet grey stranger she had married, and something in him that had been braced for years seemed very slightly to give slowly. As a man surrenders a weapon, he turned and held out the scarred hand into the candlelight. It was cruelly burned, the skin drawn tight and shining over the knuckles, 2 fingers that would not fully straighten. She took it in both of hers as gently as she had ever taken anything, and she did not flinch, and she did not stare, and she did not make the small sound of pity that she knew he had spent 7 years learning to dread. She only warmed a little of the salve between her own palms and began, with the sure light touch her mother had taught her, to work it into the ruined skin. There, she murmured, more to the hand than to the man. There, that is better, is it not? The cold makes it cruel. This will not cure it. Nothing cures a scar, we only teach it to be kinder, but it will ease the pull, and you will sleep. She glanced up once, and found him staring at her hands upon his hand, as though he had never in his life seen such a thing. Who has been tending these for you? She asked, though she already knew. No one, Gabriel Thorne said. No one has touched them since. He stopped. His throat moved. No one, he said again. Well, said Eleanor, working the salve into the second stubborn finger. Someone shall now. He let her finish. He stood in the moonlight and let a stranger hold his ruined hand and tend it. And when she had done and pressed the little jar into his good palm, and told him to use it morning and night, and to come to her when it was gone, he closed his fingers around it and looked at her with those clear grey eyes gone bright. And he said, in a voice she had to lean close to hear, "Thank you." Only that. But she had heard men thank her for saving their lives with less feeling in it, and she went back to her cold bed strangely warmed, and lay a long while listening, and did not hear the sleepless tread again that night. After that the house changed, in the slow way a season changes, so that you cannot name the day it turned, and only know one morning that the light has altered. Gabriel began to dine with her. The first time it was awkward past bearing. The two of them at opposite ends of a table built for 20. He seated always with the scarred side to the shadow, speaking in stiff monosyllables of the weather and the road. But Eleanor was patient, and she had a gift, honed at 100 sick-beds, for filling a fearful silence with easy talk that asked nothing back. And by degrees the dinners grew longer, and the silences less afraid. She told him of the shop, of her father, of the great ledger and the blue bottles and the customers of Wexcombe, with their coughs and their agues and their broken hearts. He listened as a man listens who has been starved of ordinary voices. And little by little, in pieces, he began to speak too, of the estate, of the tenants he still quietly provided for, though he never let them see his face, of his early years at Ravenmoor that had been, she gathered, sunlit and happy once, in a version of the house she could scarcely imagine beneath its shrouds. The dinners lengthened as the autumn drew in. She learned the manner of him, that he was courteous to a fault, that he had read a great deal in 7 years of solitude, that he could be drawn, cautiously, on the subjects of books and the land and the management of a sick tenant, and that he closed like a touched anemone the instant the talk came near himself. She learned to steer wide of the near ground and let him come to it, if he came at all, in his own time. And she filled the rest with the small ordinary news of a healer's day, which she had in plenty, for she had not stopped being one merely because she had become a duchess. One evening she came late to the table with her sleeves damp to the elbow, having spent the last hour in the stable poulticing the groom's hand, which he had crushed between a gate and a restive horse and hidden, in the manner of the household, until it had swelled past hiding. She apologized for the delay and thought no more of it, and began over the soup to tell him of the injury as she might have told her father over the shop counter, the set of the bones, the swelling, what she had strapped and why. And she looked up midway to find her husband watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, arrested and almost hungry, the look of a man hearing a language he had once spoken and long since given up for lost. "You do that," he said slowly, the way she did it. "My mother. You talk of a crushed hand the way another woman talks of a length of ribbon, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to make the broken whole." It was the first time he had named her, his mother, and Eleanor held very still, the way she held still when a wild thing came near her hand and did not startle it. "It is the most natural thing in the world," she said gently. "Or it should be. Someone is hurt, and you are near, and you have the means. There is no great mystery in it, only most folk would rather look away." "She never looked away," he said. "From anything. It was—" He stopped, and turned his glass slowly on the cloth, and she thought he would close again, and braced herself to let him, but he did not. Quite. It was the best of her. He finished, very low. And the worst, that she could never once look away. And then he did change the subject gently, and she let him, but a door had opened a hand's breadth that evening that had been shut for years, and they both knew it, and neither said so. He never spoke of the fire, and she never asked. But she felt it there between them always, the shape of the thing unsaid, the way you feel a splinter under whole skin. It was Mrs. Pruitt who gave her the first true piece of it, and she gave it almost against her will. The housekeeper had thawed toward Eleanor as the others had, more slowly, watching her tend the maids and coax the master to the table with a wary respect that grew each week. One evening, changing the dressing on Alice's near-healed arm at the kitchen table with Mrs. Pruitt looking on, Eleanor said, half to herself, that it was a wicked shame such a great house should have no still-room running, that the tenants must go without simples that the estate could make for pennies, and that whoever had let so fine a physic garden fall to ruin had done the whole district a cruelty. Do not, Mrs. Pruitt said, speak so of her. Of whom? Eleanor asked, gone still. The housekeeper's broad face had crumpled all at once into an old grief. The garden was her Grace's, she said. The old Duchess. His mother. There was never a finer healer in this county, gentle or common, and never a soul she turned away. She kept that garden and that still-room with her own 2 hands, and she taught the master at her knee, and half the folk on this land are alive today because of a bottle that came out of that door for nothing. She pressed her lips together. She died in it, in the fire. And he has not opened that door since, and he never will, and if you had any kindness in you, you would stop talking of the one thing in this world that will break that man clean in half. Eleanor sat very quietly, with the roll of clean linen in her hands. So that was the shape of it. Not a monster's guilty secret, but a healer's shrine, sealed by grief. The old Duchess had been what Eleanor herself was, a woman with a garden and a gift and an open door, and she had died in her own still-room, and her heir had walled the whole of it up rather than face the place where he had lost her. How did it start? Eleanor asked gently. The fire. But there Mrs. Pruitt's confidence closed for good. That, she said, rising heavily, is not mine to tell, nor yours to ask. And she gathered up the used dressings and went, and left Eleanor alone at the kitchen table with the last of the winter light going out of the high window, and the certainty settling into her now like a stone into a pool that she was going to have to open that door. She told herself it was for the tenants, and there was truth in that. She told herself it was for the household, for a still-room running again meant simples for every crack and cough and ague under the roof, and there was truth in that too. But the deepest truth she admitted only to herself, late at night, and it was this, that she had come to love, in the quiet way of her nature, the wary, broken man she had married, and that she could not go on tending the small wounds of everyone in his house, and leave untouched the great wound at the center of it. He had let her hold his hand. She wanted, more than she had wanted anything in a long while, to help him hold the rest. The key, when she found it, was almost an accident, and she chose ever after to believe that it had wanted to be found. She had been given, by then, a ring of the household keys of her own, the stores, the linen presses, the still empty still-room cupboards in the kitchen wing, Mrs. Pruitt handing them over one grudging morning, as the plain acknowledgment that the mistress of a house must be able to open its doors. And among them, on the great iron ring, was a key she did not know, older than the rest, its ward black with age, a little curl of dead ivy caught in the loop of it, as though it had lain a long time in a drawer with something that had once been green. She knew it at once for what it was. She held it a long time in the cold morning light of the still-room passage, turning it over, and she thought of her husband's ruined hand in the candlelight, and of the Duchess who had taught him at her knee, and of the district's sick going without, and of the great wound sealed and festering at the heart of Ravenmore Hall. And then she took up a lamp, and went alone down the east passage to the low oak door bound in iron, and after a moment in which her whole honest heart argued with itself and lost, she fitted the black key to the lock. It turned stiffly, with a shriek of long rusted works, but it turned. And Eleanor Merrick pushed open the door that had not opened in 7 winters, and stepped through into the dark. The smell reached her first, and it stopped her on the threshold with her hand pressed to her mouth. Not the ash and ruin she had braced for, but ghosts. Lavender, dried to dust, and yet still lavender. The bitter green of rue. Bruised mint, gone to a brown breath, and under it all, old and terrible and faint, the char of burnt timber and the cold soot of a fire long dead. It was the smell of her own life's work laid over the smell of catastrophe, and it went through her like grief. She lifted the lamp. The still room opened before her, long and low, and she saw that it was not, as she had imagined, a gutted ruin. The fire had not taken all of it. One end was blackened past saving, the roof there fallen in and boarded over, the great copper still that had stood there twisted and slumped in its brickwork like something that had died in agony. But the other end, the far end, stood almost whole, only thick with 7 years of dust and the wreck of the smoke. And there Eleanor saw, ranged along the walls in the swinging lamplight, the shelves and jars and bunched dead herbs of a working still-room. Exactly as they must have stood the night the woman who kept them walked out of the room and never came back. Rows of stoppered bottles, their contents long since dried to crusts, each one labeled in a fine sloped hand. Hanging bunches of herbs gone to grey ghosts of themselves, still tied with the faded ribbon that had hung them, a long scrubbed worktable, the tools of the craft laid out upon it, mortar and pestle, a set of brass scales, a rack of little knives laid out, Eleanor saw with a catch in her throat, as though for a morning's work that had never come. And at the end of the table, closed, its cover buckled with old damp. A book. She crossed to it as though drawn on a thread. She set down the lamp and wiped the dust from the cover with her sleeve, and opened it, and found herself looking at the hand she already half knew. The fine, sloped hand of the labels, filling page after page with the whole heart's knowledge of a healer. Receipts for salves and syrups and cordials. Notes on which tenant's ague answered to what. A pressed sprig of something between 2 pages, crumbling to powder. It was the Duchess's own book, her still-room book, the twin and mother of the little cramped book Eleanor kept on her own mantel, and holding it Eleanor felt the strangest sensation of her life, as though she had reached back through the fire and taken the hand of a woman she had never met, a healer like herself, and found the grip still warm. She was weeping without having meant to, quietly, turning the brittle pages, when she heard the door. She turned. Gabriel Thorne stood on the threshold of the sealed room, a lamp in his good hand, and his scarred face in the light of it was not managed now, not turned to any shadow, because he had forgotten in his shock to manage it. He was looking past her, at the room, at the twisted still, and the dead herbs, and the long table laid for a morning that never came. And on his ruined face was such a nakedness of grief and terror and old, old love, that Eleanor forgot the book, forgot the tenants, forgot every good reason she had told herself, and understood that she had walked, uninvited, straight into the deepest chamber of another soul. "Get out," he said. But his voice broke on it, and he did not move, and she saw that he could not, that he was frozen on the threshold of this room, as he had been frozen for 7 years, unable to go in and unable now to make her go. Gabriel. It was the first time she had used his name. She said it softly, the way she said things to the frightened and the feverish, and she did not go out, and she did not go to him, but stood where she was with his mother's book held to her breast. Gabriel, I am not afraid of it. Come and see. Nothing here can hurt you now. Come and see what she left. And the Duke of Ravenmore, who had not crossed that threshold since the night he crossed it to carry his mother's body out, stood shaking in the doorway of the burned stillroom, and did not go, and did not flee. And at last, when Eleanor held out her hand to him across the dusty dark, he looked at it as though it were the last solid thing in a falling world. And he came in. He told her. That night. It came out of him slowly at first, and then all at once, the way a fever breaks, there in the ruined stillroom by the light of 2 lamps, with his mother's book open on the scrubbed table between them and the char smell of the worst night of his life all around. Eleanor had guessed the shape of the tragedy. She had not guessed the whole of it, and the whole of it was worse and better than the district's cruel telling, both at once. His mother, the late Duchess, had been what Mrs. Pruitt said and more, a healer of rare gift, who had turned the estate's whole physic garden and stillroom to the service of the district, and kept her door open to gentle and common alike. Gabriel had grown up at her elbow in that room. It had been the warmest place of his early years, he said, the fire under the still, the good green smell, his mother's sloped hand teaching his own to weigh and measure. He had meant once to be no sort of duke at all, only a man who kept a garden and did some good with it, the way she did. Then, the autumn of the fire, a putrid fever had come into the district, the spotted fever, the low folk called it, that took the throat and the lungs and burned the life out of the strong and the weak alike. It had gone through the cottages like a scythe. And the Duchess had shut herself up in her stillroom night after night, working at a remedy, not a certain cure, for there was no certain cure, but a cordial to break the fever's heat and hold the throat open, compounded of a dozen simples, in a proportion she was still, that last week, refining by the day. She had been close, she had said so. A little more, she had said, and I shall have it, and then not one more of them need die. The night of the fire, she had been at the still late, distilling a spirit for the cordial, when something caught, a flame leapt from the burner to the spirit, and the spirit to the dried herbs hung all about, and the old timber of the roof, and in a breath the far end of the room was a furnace. There had been others in the room. There was always someone in that room. That night it had been the housemaid who kept the fire, and old Ferris the gardener come in from the cold to fill a barrow with dried lavender for the linen presses, and they had been trapped, the 2 of them, at the burning end, cut off by the fallen burning beam of the roof. I was in the garden, Gabriel said. His voice had gone very flat, the flatness of a thing carried too long. I heard them. I went in. The beam had come down across the way out, and it was all fire, and Ferris was under the end of it, pinned, and the maid could not get past. So he looked down at his ruined hand on the table, the 2 fingers that would not straighten. So I lifted it, the burning end of it, long enough for them to crawl clear beneath. That is how, this the hand, and the arm, and the rest. He touched, without seeming to know he did it, the drawn scar at his jaw. It is not a mystery how I came by them. I held a burning beam off 2 people's backs until they were out from under it. Any man would have. It is the least a man could do. And your mother, Eleanor said very gently. His face did not change, and that was the worst of it. She was out, he said. She had got out with the first of them at the very start. She was safe on the grass. And then his jaw worked. And then she remembered the cordial, the receipt. The one she had nearly finished. That would have, she thought of the district, you see. She thought of all the throats it might yet save that winter. And while I was under the beam with Ferris and the maid, she went back in for it, for the book, and the last of the compound. She went back into the fire for a receipt to save people she had never met. And the roof came down. And when I had got the others out and turned to find her she was, he stopped. He did not finish. He did not have to. Eleanor sat with her hands folded on the dead Duchess's book and let the silence hold him. She had sat with a great deal of grief in her life, at a great many sickbeds, and she had learned that there is a kind of listening that is itself a medicine, and she gave it to him now, whole, asking nothing, hurrying nothing. They said in the district that I did it. He said at last, lo, that I was drunk, or careless, or that I set it, that I let her burn. I heard it. It came back to me, the way such things do. And I found that I could not go into a room and be looked at, and know that every soul in it was thinking there is the man who let his own mother burn, and marveling at God's justice in the mark of it on his face, his mouth twisted. So I let them say it. It was easier to be the beast of Ravenmore than to stand in a church and explain that she died going back for a receipt to save strangers, and that I have her blood on me because I chose 2 servants' lives and did not choose, could not reach, hers. Do you understand? I did not let her burn. But I did not save her either. I saved Ferris and the maid, and she went back, and I have spent 7 years not knowing whether that makes me a hero or a murderer, and I could not bear to have the county weigh it for me. So I sealed the door, and I let them think the worst, and I have not been warm since. And there it was, the truth the locked garden had held all along. Not a guilty man's secret, an innocent man's shame, which is a stranger and a crueler thing. He had walked into the fire and lifted the beam and saved the 2 lives he could reach, and the world had called him a monster for the one he could not, and he had believed them. Because grief will always believe the worst account of itself. He had sealed his mother's stillroom, not to hide a crime, but to bury a shrine he could not look at. And in doing so he had sealed away the very thing that might have redeemed the loss. Her work, her book, her nearly finished cure, walled up in the dark to crumble, while the district she had died trying to save, went on without it. You saved 2 people's lives, Eleanor said, when she trusted herself to speak. With your own body, with this hand. That is not the least a man could do, Gabriel, it is nearly the most. And your mother, she laid her palm flat on the open book. Your mother did not die because you failed her. She died because she was the kind of woman who runs back into a fire for a receipt that might save strangers. She died as she lived, with her whole heart. You did not do that to her. She did that. Because she was brave and good, and you are her heir in more than a title, because you did the very same thing in the very same fire, You ran toward the burning to save whom you could reach. You are not the monster of this story. You are the other one who ran in. He was weeping now, silently, this great, scarred man, in the ruin of his mother's stillroom, and Eleanor rose and went around the table and did the thing she had been aching to do since the chancel step. She put her arms around him, scars and grief and all, and held him, and he let her, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, while the two lamps burned down and the ghosts of lavender hung in the dark. They did not speak of it again directly in the days that followed, but everything was changed all the same, in the way a room is changed once a shuttered window has been opened, though you close it again against the night. He had given her the worst of himself, and she had not flinched, and a man cannot unknow that he has been seen and not recoiled from. He began to seek her out by daylight, now, not only at the table. She would look up from the kitchen, where she was straining a syrup, and find him in the doorway, come on some invented errand. Lingering, he walked with her once, the length of the wet formal garden, on the paths that did not go near the sealed door, and told her the names the old plantings had gone by, and let her take his ruined arm on the slick stones without drawing it away. She, for her part, went on tending the small hurts of the house, and let him watch her do it, for she had understood that the watching was itself a kind of healing for him, that to see a hand crushed and then mended, a scald dressed and then closed, a fever in a maid met and turned back, was to be told over and over, without a word of doctrine, that hurt was not always the end of the story, that some wounds answered to care, that some sealed rooms might perhaps be opened. He said as much to her, obliquely, one evening by the hall fire, turning the little jar of comfrey salve over and over in his good hand. You mend everything you touch, he said. It was not quite a compliment, there was something almost fearful in it. A man watching a tide come in toward a wall he had spent years building. The maids. The old men. The groom. This hand. He looked at the ruined fingers, which straightened a little further now than they had in years. I begin to be afraid of what you will try to mend next. Only what will let me, she said. I have never yet forced a cure on anyone. It cannot be done. A wound has to consent to be cleaned, Gabriel. I can only be near and ready for when it does. And she let that lie between them, unpressed, and did not look toward the east passage, and neither did he. But they both heard the door in it, all the same. The fever came 3 weeks later, and it came, as such things do, without warning and from within. It began with Alice, the housemaid whose scald Eleanor had healed. She came to the morning's work, grey-faced and shivering, and by noon she could not stand, and by evening the fever was on her in earnest, the high, dry heat, the labouring breath, the dark flush coming up mottled at her throat. Eleanor knew it before she had finished crossing the sick-room. She had heard it described in her father's shop by frightened travellers, and she had read of it in the Duchess's own book not a fortnight past. The putrid fever, the spotted fever, the same scythe that had come through the district the autumn of the fire had come again, out of some fouled well or tainted cargo or ill wind, and it had come, this time, into the shut and shrunken household of Ravenmore Hall. By the next morning 2 more had it, a kitchen maid, and old Pettigrew the footman, whose smoke-scarred chest could ill afford it. By the day after, 4, it ran through the close-quartered household like fire through dried herbs, and Eleanor, standing in the doorway of the servants' hall that they had turned into a sick room. 4 low beds in a row and more to come, understood with a cold, clear certainty exactly what she was facing, and exactly how alone she was going to face it. For no physician would come. She sent the groom galloping the first morning, and he came back at dusk with his cap in his hands. The new physician in Wexcombe, the one who scorned apothecaries, would not set foot in a spotted fever house, and would not for the Duke of Ravenmore himself, whom he liked no better than the common folk did, nor would the next town's man. A fever house on a cursed hill, kept by a scarred recluse, was a place the whole prospering world had agreed to let alone. There was, in the end, no one coming. There was only Eleanor Merrick, apothecary's kin, and her mortar and her linen and her little book, and, she thought, standing in that doorway with her sleeves already rolled, one thing more. One thing the whole rest of the world did not have. She had a stillroom, she had a physic garden, and she had, laid open on the scrubbed table in that unsealed room, the receipt of a woman who had died trying to finish a cure for this very fever. Gabriel, she said, finding him in the west gallery, where he had retreated, ashen, at the first word of the sickness, for a man who had lost his mother to fever in a still-room might be forgiven for going white at the sound of it. Gabriel, I need the garden, not the burned end. The garden, the walled physic garden, whatever still grows there or can be made to. And I need her book, and I need her still-room, and I need you not to seal them again, but to help me open them all the way. There is a fever in this house, and no doctor on earth is coming, and the only medicine within 20 miles is the one your mother spent her life making and her death trying to finish. I can read her hand. I have her book. I think. She took his cold-scarred hand in both of hers. I think I can finish it, Gabriel. I think she left it near enough done that I can finish it. But not without that room. Will you open it? All the way? Will you let her work save them? The way she wanted it to? She watched the war in him, the terror of that room, the memory of the last fever that had come out of it, set against the 4 beds filling in the servants' hall, and the thing she was asking, which was nothing less than to unseal the wound at the center of his life and let it be used. It was a great deal to ask of a broken man. She asked it anyway, because there were lives in the balance, and because she believed, with the whole of her healer's faith, that the only true way to mend a sealed wound is to open it to the air. Yes, said Gabriel Thorne. His voice shook, but he did not look away, and he did not turn his scarred side to the shadow. Open it. Open all of it. Tell me what to do. What followed were the hardest days of Eleanor's life, and, though she did not know it then, the days that made it. They opened the still-room to the light. Gabriel himself tore the boards from the sound windows with his own hands, the good and the ruined both, and let the grey autumn day into the room that had been dark for 7 years. And Eleanor set the maids who were still standing to scrubbing the long table and the shelves, while she read and reread the Duchess's receipt by daylight until she had it by heart. The cordial, a dozen simples, weighed and compounded and drawn off in a proportion the dead woman had worked and reworked in the margins, feverfew and willow bark for the heat, coltsfoot and horehound for the labouring chest, a bitter tincture of gentian honey and vinegar for the throat, and at the heart of it a distilled spirit of a particular flower that the Duchess had underlined 3 times and marked. In her last and shakiest note, the whole virtue is in this: do not stint it. And that flower grew, if it grew anywhere, behind the walls of the sealed physic garden. They went out to it together in the grey cold, Eleanor and Gabriel and Mrs. Pruitt, with the great iron key, to the gate wound shut, with 7 years of dead briar. Gabriel cut the briar away himself, the thorns catching at his coat, and set his shoulder to the swollen gate, and it gave with a groan, and the 3 of them stepped through into the walled garden that no one had tended since the woman who made it died. It should have been a ruin, and much of it was, the beds gone to nettle and dock, the paths lost, the espaliered fruit run wild against the walls. But a physic garden is a stubborn thing, planted by a healer who chose her plants for hardiness as much as virtue, and beneath the weeds, self-seeded and gone half wild but alive, Eleanor found them. Feverfew, a whole ragged host of it, the little daisy faces gone over but the leaf still good. Rue and horehound in a grey tangle. Willow, 3 low pollarded trees along the wall, their bark there for the stripping. And in the far corner, in the lee of the south wall where the frost came latest, a straggle of the particular flower, the one underlined 3 times, gone leggy and wild and past its best, but there, still there, seeded from the Duchess's own hand and waiting, all these 7 years, for someone to come back and need it. Eleanor knelt in the cold ruined garden with the last of the flowers in her hands and wept, once, hard, for the woman who had planted them and never come back. And then she wiped her face and stood and became entirely the thing she was. Baskets, she said. All of it. Every leaf and every root and every strip of bark on the list, and the whole of these, roots and all. Mrs. Pruitt, we will need every fire in the kitchen and the still drawing by nightfall. Gabriel, she looked at her husband, standing in his mother's garden in the grey light, the walls he had sealed thrown open around him. Gabriel, I am going to need your hands, both of them. She taught you at this table. I need you to remember. And he did. That was the wonder of those days, the thing Eleanor carried ever after, that the broken recluse of Ravenmoor, who had not entered his mother's stillroom in 7 years, stood at her scrubbed table night after night through the worst of the fever, and remembered. His mother's hand had taught his own to weigh and measure, year upon year, and the knowledge had not burned away. It had only been sealed up with everything else. He weighed the feverfew to the grain. He tended the still, the small sound still at the unburned end, that they cleaned and set drawing, with the sure attention of a man who had learned it at the knee of the woman who died at it. And if his eyes were wet as he watched the spirit come off the flower she had underlined 3 times, he did not turn his scarred face to the shadow, not once, in all those nights. He worked in the full light beside his wife, and he made his mother's medicine, and the making of it did for him what no salve of Eleanor's ever could. They worked in shifts around the clock, the 2 of them and Mrs. Pruitt, and every maid still on her feet. Eleanor scarcely slept. She moved between the stillroom and the sick-room in a fog of purpose, dosing the fevered with the cordial the moment the first batch came off the still, a spoonful every hour, cool cloths, the throat kept open, the chest eased, the fight for each labouring breath, fought at each bedside by main strength and vigilance, and the dead Duchess's compounded flowers. She lost sleep and weight and the feeling in her feet. She did not lose a single soul. Alice's fever broke on the third night, the dark flush fading, the breath coming clear, the kitchen maids on the fourth. Old Pettigrew, whose smoke-scarred chest she had feared for most, she sat beside herself through the worst night of it, dosing and cooling and coaxing each breath. And toward dawn his fever broke too, and he opened his eyes and asked, hoarsely, for his tea. And Eleanor laughed and wept at once, and knew that the cordial held. Mrs. Pruitt herself went down on the fourth day, and would not admit it until she fainted at the still-room door with a tray still in her hands. Eleanor caught her, and got her to a bed, and found the fever already high, and the old woman's pulse galloping and thin, and understood that the housekeeper had been carrying it a full day, working through it, saying nothing, because there was no one else to keep the house standing, and she would sooner die than be another mouth for the mistress to spoon medicine into. Eleanor sat with her that night, as she had sat with none of the others, for she had grown to love the stern, loyal creature, and she scolded her softly through the worst of it, that a woman who kept the keys to a whole great house had no business keeping the key to her own illness locked as well, that she was to hand it over now, the way she had handed over the key to the sealed door, and let herself be tended for once in her hard life. Mrs. Pruitt, half in the fever's dream, gripped Eleanor's wrist and said things she would never have said waking, that she had loved the old Duchess like a sister, that she had been in the yard the night of the fire, and had seen with her own eyes what the master did, and what the master's mother did, and that she had held her tongue 7 years because he asked it, because he could not bear the telling, but that it had eaten at her like a canker to hear the district call that good brave man a monster. He held the beam, she said, over and over, her eyes bright and unseeing. I saw him hold the beam. Tell them. Someone must tell them. And Eleanor cooled her brow and dosed her, and told her low and steady that that the telling would come, that she was only to breathe now and let the fever break, and live to see it. It broke before dawn, the 5th morning, the way the others had, and Mrs. Pruitt woke weak and clear-eyed and mortified to find herself the one in the bed. Eleanor would not let her rise for 2 days, and the two of them were, after that, something more than mistress and housekeeper, allies, bound by the same secret and the same stubborn refusal to let a single soul in that house be lost. It was on the 5th day, with the sick room turning the corner and the worst behind them, that the fever took the one person Eleanor had not thought to fear for, Gabriel. He had worked himself past the edge of his strength, and told no one, the way such men do. She found him slumped at the still-room table at dawn, the grey flush already mottling at his throat above the old scars, the heat pouring off him, and her heart, which had held so steady through a household of sickness, at last went to water. She got him to his bed with Mrs. Pruitt's help, and then Eleanor Merrick, who had married this man to save her father and stayed to save his house, sat down at the bedside of the husband she had somewhere in those hard weeks come wholly to love, and fought the fever for him with everything the garden and the book and her own 2 hands could give. It was a near thing. He was strong, but he was scarred deep in the chest from the old smoke, and the fever went for the weak places the way fever always does, and on the 2nd night it climbed past anything the cordial had yet had to hold. and his breath came in the dreadful laboring rattle she had heard from too many beds. Eleanor did not leave him. She dosed him past the hours she had dosed the others. She stripped the fever's heat with cool cloths through the black middle of the night. She kept his throat open and his chest eased, and she talked to him, low and steady, through the delirium. Of the garden coming back, of the tenants who would have their simples again, of his mother's book and his mother's flower and the 2 lives he had carried out of the fire, telling him over and over in the dark that he was not the monster of the story, that he was the other one who ran in, that he was needed here, in the warm on the living side of the door, and that she was not, whatever the fever whispered, going to let him go back into the fire after his mother now. Toward dawn on the 3rd night, at the very hour his mother had died 7 years before, the fever broke. She felt it under her hand, the terrible heat giving way all at once to a cool, clean sweat. The laboring breath easing, deepening, slowing into the true sleep that is the body's own word for I shall live. Gabriel's scarred hand, which she had held through the whole black night, closed of its own accord around hers. And Eleanor Merrick put her head down on the edge of her husband's bed, in the grey light of the morning that gave him back to her, and wept as she had not let herself weep in all the weeks of it, out of pure exhaustion and pure relief, and a love she no longer had any wish to call by any other name. The district heard of it before the month was out, the way such things carry, that there had been the spotted fever at Ravenmore Hall, the whole household down with it and no doctor within 20 miles that would come, and that not one soul had died. That the scarred duke's strange, quiet wife, the apothecary's kin, they had all pitied for being sold to a monster, had gone into the old duchess's sealed stillroom and brought out a cordial that broke the fever clean, the same cure the old duchess had been making the autumn she died. The story turned in the telling, as stories do. But this time, it turned toward the light. Folk remembered the old duchess now, and her open door, and her charity, and a few who were honest remembered that they had never rightly known how the fire started, and had perhaps been too ready to think the worst of a grieving man with a marked face. And then the fever, which had spared Ravenmore, went on into the district as it had gone 7 years before, and this time Ravenmore did not seal its door against it. Eleanor made the cordial by the gallon in the duchess's still-room, and Gabriel carried it out himself in the estate cart to the cottages of the tenants, his scarred face bare to the daylight, and the weather and the eyes of the people he had hidden from for 7 years. Because there was fever in their houses, and medicine in his, and a man cannot deliver the one while managing the angle of his own face. They looked at him. Of course they looked, and then they took the bottle, and blessed him, and asked how much they owed, and he told them what his mother had always told them, which was nothing, nothing at all, only get well, and half the district that winter had reason to be glad the sealed door of Ravenmore had at last been opened. The Wexcombe physician came at last, when it was over. The same man who had refused to set foot on the cursed hill rode up its avenue a month after the fever passed, half in professional curiosity and half, Eleanor suspected, in the uneasy conscience of a man who has heard that a house he abandoned had saved itself without him. He had come, he said stiffly, to see this cordial the country people would not stop talking of. Gabriel received him in the reopened stillroom, his scarred face bare in the good daylight, and did not turn it to any shadow, and Eleanor showed the man the receipt in the late Duchess's own hand, and the still drawing, and the ranked bottles going out to the tenants, and watched the scorn go out of his face by degrees, and something older and more honest come into it. "This is not superstition," he said at length, turning a bottle in the light. It cost him something to say it. "This is physic, careful physic. Where did—" He looked from the sloped hand of the receipt to Eleanor's plain, steady face, and understood, perhaps, several things at once. "Your mother's? Your Grace?" he asked Gabriel, more quietly than he had said anything yet. "My mother's," said Gabriel. "She was finishing it the autumn she died. My wife finished it for her. And it was Mrs. Pruitt, standing by with her keys, who added the rest, who told the physician, plainly and without being asked, in the flat carrying voice of a woman done at last with holding her tongue, exactly what had happened the night of the fire. How the Duchess had got clear and then gone back for the receipt to save the district. How the master had held a burning beam off 2 trapped servants until they crawled free, and come by his scars in the doing of it, and been called a murderer for the one soul he could not reach. She said it once, to the one man in the county whose word carried, and she said it as fact and not as plea, and then she took up her tray and went about her work. The physician was quiet a long moment. Then he bowed to Gabriel, lower than a proud man bows without cause, and said that he had been wrong, and that he would say so where it would do the most good, and he was as good as his word. The truth went out through the county the way the cordial had from that day, and it did not undo 7 years in a season, for nothing does. But the crossing of themselves stopped. The word monster died on the district's tongue, and doors that had been shut against the scarred Duke of Ravenmore began one by one to open. Her father lived to see it. That was the mercy Eleanor had scarcely dared pray for. Gabriel had sent for Josiah in the first thaw after the fever, without telling her, and she had come down one morning to find her father, that frail, stooped apothecary with ink-stained fingers, sitting by the great fire in the hall with a rug over his knees, and the best colour in his face she had seen in 2 years, for the whorehound and the warm rooms and the ease of a debt forgiven had done for his chest what no sponging house winter would ever have allowed. He had wept to see her, and wept again to see the stillroom running, and within a week the old man was pottering the length of the physic garden on Gabriel's arm, the two of them talking of tinctures and grafts and the right way to dry a root, and Eleanor stood at the window and watched her husband walk her father through his mother's garden in the pale spring sun, and thought her heart would not hold what it was being asked to hold. They opened the garden fully that spring, the two of them together. They cleared the beds and mended the paths and cut back the wild espaliers, and they had the fallen, burned end of the stillroom rebuilt at last. Not hidden, not sealed, but made new, the twisted old still taken reverently down, and a new one set in its place, so that the whole room ran again as it had in the Duchess's day, fragrant with lavender and bruised mint, its door standing open to the district. Gabriel had a stone set into the mended wall, low and plain, with his mother's name upon it, and beneath it only the words, "She taught me this," and no one who came for a bottle ever failed to touch it going by. He was not, all at once, unbroken. Scars do not heal so, nothing cures a scar. Eleanor had told him once, we only teach it to be kinder. But he learned to be kinder to his own. He dined in the light, He walked the estate by day. He let the tenants see his face, and found that the world did not end, that a marked man delivering medicine is, to the sick, simply a man delivering medicine, and that the fear he had carried had been half his own. And at night, when the old burns pulled in the damp, Eleanor warmed the good comfrey salve between her palms, and worked it into the ruined hand as she had that first cold night, and he no longer flinched from the touch, but turned his whole scarred face to her in the candlelight, into the light, and let himself be seen, and be tended, and be loved. The door at the end of the east passage was never locked again. On warm evenings it stood open to the garden, and the smell of lavender and bruised mint came in along the passage where once the smell of ash had hung, and the servants no longer lowered their eyes going by, but often as not stopped to breathe it in. The county came to call the place not the Cursed Hill, but the Healing House, and to speak of the scarred duke and his quiet wife with the particular warmth folk keep for those who have been unjustly grieved and are grieved no longer. They had married as a bargain, a debt and a sacrifice. A frightened woman and a broken man traded across a factor's smiling ledger. What grew between them in the ruin of a sealed garden was something neither had bargained for, and neither would afterward have traded for any sum on earth. She had come to save her father, and had saved a household and a legacy, and a man the whole world had given up as a monster. He had shut himself away from every eye that might look at him, and had been found, at last, by the one pair of eyes that looked at his ruin and saw not a beast but a wound, and knew, being a healer, exactly what to do. There was a door at the heart of Ravenmore Hall that had not opened in 7 winters. And then a quiet woman with a mortar and a roll of linen and a little book of remedies came up the dark hill to pay her father's debt, and she opened it and let in the light, and the healing house was warm again, all the way to its heart, and stayed warm all their lives.